I'm Robert Royal. This is a selection of my work since I arrived to Spain in 1963 until now. Actually, the oldest photograph in this show is 1967, and the most recent is 2014, the proclamation of His Majesty Philip VI. The show covers around 40 photographs, divided between politics, fashion, which is actually the first work I started doing in Spain, and my last epoch of photography is architecture, which is something I was always interested in, and that actually was the story of the time, was the growth of Spain and the development of the economic development and the growth of the skyscrapers, both in Madrid and in Barcelona. Well, all the pictures have their own history, and each one of them reminds me of some great journalists I worked with when I took the pictures, because at the time, what they call here the transition, el cambio, that period between, let's say, 75 and I guess 82, when Felipe González was elected, precisely on the theme of el cambio, the change. All the great journalists who came to Spain to work and write there, everybody was hot to write the Spanish story. Gavin Scott from Time magazine, and Carson Prager, James Markham from New York Times. He actually came here straight from Vietnam, I think. This photograph of Guardia Civil, it was around Burgos somewhere. I forget exactly where I took it, but it was during the trials. I think they called it the Burgos trials. And I said, it was such a beautiful picture. I said, well, maybe I'm going to get shot, but I'm going to make this picture. So I made the picture of him. He obviously didn't shoot. And I think it's a beautiful image. I have a very good memory of those wonderful hats. As a matter of fact, it's very funny, some American journalist said, oh, the police are wearing the hat like the bullfighters. So there are photographs of course, Francisco Franco, and this photograph of Leopoldo Calvo Sotelo, who was sort of the interim president, and the great Adolfo Suarez. I did a photograph for Time magazine, a cover photograph for Time magazine. That's not in the show. There's a lot of manifestations in the street, which, I attended to. Smelled a lot of tear gas and that. But I don't have any here. I have a picture of this young girl trying to get across the road and get away from the tear gas. But luckily, that was a period that was a lot of manifestations, demonstrations from the left and the right. It was a polemic period, but it didn't last very long, and democracy won out, I'm very happy to say. I mean, whatever you think about the government now, that was an exhilarating period of time in Spain. There's Felipe González when he came here in 1977 in his traje de pano and his corduroy suit, and there is exactly that freshness and difference in his appearance that I think brought him the most votes and eventually brought him to power, because this interim, all these politicians would shout, wave their arms, and roll their eyes, and all this dramatic speeches beseeching Spain to do this and Spain to do that. Well, Spain had had enough of that. So, a cool guy like Felipe, and very brilliant in politics as well as in other subjects, he won the election. Then we end up with Jose Maria Aznar, when he was elected in the office in Moncloa. And after him, I didn't dedicate myself to taking pictures of presidents anymore. But there's a nice picture of him. Actually, the fact is, there's a funny story about the picture that I took of him. We had an appointment with him in Moncloa. There was the journalist was interviewing him, and then I was lighting for the picture in his office, in the Nobel office. And we had got the picture lighted, and then his assistant called him, and he came in the room, and on the first flash, we had lots of flashes and all that, and the first flashes, all the lights went out. It blew the fuses, but I can hear in the dark. I could hear his bodyguards taking their guns out of the holsters, and all of a sudden, we were all standing there in the dark, wondering what the hell's going to happen. And this little voice, Jose Maria Aznar, in a very small voice, said, "Cómo nos han dejado la casa," referring to the recent exit of the socialists. But anyway, they fixed. It was the fuses, blew the fuses. They fixed the fuses, and we continued and made the picture. The pictures in this exhibit. I had a great opportunity of meeting most of the famous designers of the era. I'm talking about late 60s and 70s, especially Pertegaz, Elio Bahagne, Rodriguez. They were all well-known names at the time. So since there was not a lot of fashion photographers around, there were not a lot of photographers around almost anywhere. There was really an underemployed segment of the population. That anyway, I made good contacts with those, and I shot their catalogs, some catalogs for them, and some of those pictures are here. There's a portrait of Manuel Pertegaz that when he opened his chain of ready-to-wear stores in Spain, I don't know how many stores, he must have opened 6 or 8 stores. There was one here in Madrid, I believe, it was on La Gasca. I did a portrait of him, and he had this portrait like 2 meters by 2 meters, and all of his stores. That picture is in the exhibition, and some of his my favorite clothes, dresses that he did. Also, a little later on in time, we get to Jesus del Pozo, who initially begun to take to design men's clothes. So I got to know Jesus, and we did a lot of photographs. There's a portrait of him here, and a very nice one of his beautiful dresses is here. And at the time on Serrano, there was a designer named Mitsu, who designed and made for the high society hunting clothes. She made fashion and leather. And so she made clothes for the casa, for las casas. No, they were very main social activity in the Franquist era. And she made beautiful hunting costumes for the Franco family, the Franco girls, and other society ladies. And so she's here. In the show, and one of her beautiful dresses, which was shot in Trujillo. Somehow I got a contact and started making photographs, industrial photographs, for a company that made cement. And they were the investors in Torre Picasso. So I started taking pictures of Torre Picasso. In fact, I went there once a week for about 3 years to take pictures of how it developed and this, that, and the other. And the picture you see here, I don't know if you can see it in the background, but the picture in the exhibit is a photograph from a helicopter, and you see an enormous sign hanging on the building that the promoter hung on the building. You know, it's a typical sign that says now renting or alquiler, oficinas en alquiler, but it was an enormous sign. It was about 6 or 8 floors high, and it was supported by an enormous steel bar. And the cables went inside and were anchored inside the building. They'd taken the windows out. So the day after I took this photograph, there was a windstorm in Madrid, and that sign fell down. Luckily, it didn't hit anybody in the head because it must have weighed, without exaggerating, half a ton or something. And after that, I sort of got a little reputation as a photographer of work, of buildings and under construction. So I went from that building to the next, what they call the Torresquillo, which in fact is really Puerto de Europa. And I did that for a while. Actually, about halfway through the building, it went bankrupt. Well, it didn't actually go bankrupt. Iraq attacked Kuwait, which was at that time was the Kuwait investment office was the principal investor. So from one day to when Iraq attacked Kuwait, from one day to the next, all the money disappeared. About 1,500. A vast amount of money, millions, disappeared, and the work stopped immediately, and everybody who was owed money had to wait about 1.5 years to collect their money finally. And I've completed the building. We did some shots of the completed building, and shortly after that, the 4 towers of Castellana begun, and so I carried on doing that for another 3 or 4 years, and then I did the Repsol, which there are no photographs. That Repsol was the initial promoter of the building. You see, the first building closest to Plaza Casillas, the first building was produced by, promoted by Repsol as their international office, but they never occupied it. They sold it. They sold it to Banquilla for a vast amount of money, and they built their own world headquarters near Atocha. One of my favorite events of all times in Spain was photographing the signing of the signing. It was signed by Felipe González, I guess, in 1986, of Spain's adhesion to the European Treaty. It was held in an enormous, beautiful hall in the Royal Palace. Of course, His Majesty Juan Carlos was there. Many of the European leaders were there. It was a spectacular European event, and there was a tremendous feeling of peace and unity. The people I've chosen to show pictures of are some of my favorite personalities. Maestro Rodrigo. These are people who actually I knew about before I ever came to Spain. Maestro Rodrigo, the world-famous guitarist Andres Segovia, Edward Chillida, who has several sculptures in North America that I had seen before meeting him and taking photographs of him at his beautiful home in San Sebastian. A curious thing about, I was assigned by a newspaper, the New York Times, to take a picture of Maestro Rodrigo, which I went to his home, and he was kindly received me and his wife, who is really his sight and his guide through all these things, assisted me, and he played the piano for me. Fantastic gentleman. And while I was there, my wife called me and said, they're trying to get in touch with you from another magazine, I forget which, because today is Andres Segovia's 92nd birthday. So in fact, in the morning I took pictures of Maestro Rodrigo in the same morning, and then around lunchtime I took pictures of Andres Segovia, which I thought was a wonderful coincidence. This is a photograph of Ukulele, who was and is one of the most well-known photographers of the Movida, what they call the Movida in Spain, and Juan Janis, who was actually a Hungarian immigrant who landed here during the Second World War and became the most famous society photographer, of the era. He took pictures of just about everybody's wedding. And in fact, when he and Ukulele got together, he said, "You look like somebody I know." And he dug into his files, and he had photographed Ukulele's mother's wedding. And he dug the pictures out. That's how he kept his archives, which is something photographers normally do. So that's, I took a picture of them together, and they're both smiling. So that's the Movida and the Franquist era society photographer together.